In March 1991, the Revolutionary United Front, headed by a guy named Corporal Fode Sanko, invaded the country through the assistance of Charles Taylor. And they came with a mandate to overthrow the government at the time. The president at the time was called Joseph Momo. But they too were very unsuccessful. And as these vain revolutions go, when they are unsuccessful, they turn against civilians. It's rather ironic that they come preaching to liberate people, but in the end, turn against the people they're there to liberate. Thousands of people were killed, raped, and maimed for a decade. The most important issue was in 1996, the international community got involved in the civil war, and they decided to conduct an election to put an end to the conflict. The rebels at the time disagreed with that election, but the government of the day, after so much killing, decided that the future of the country had to be determined through the democratic process. In fact, the slogan of that election was, "The future is in your hands." And the rebels decided that if we literally chopped up their hands, the future won't be in their hands. This is one of the reasons why so many people got amputated during the Sierra Leonean conflict. It is reported that one of the youngest person to get their limbs chopped off was about 6 months old. In fact, there was a short documentary recently about one of those babies who got their hands cut off. I tell you this just to illustrate the insanity of that conflict, the senselessness of the killing that happened in Sierra Leone for a decade. Luckily for us, in about 2000, the international community decided that the insanity of that civil war was unacceptable. So the United Nations intervened together with the British. So then the war was declared over, disarmament occurred. I give you a summary of this because I want to get to really the basic points that we're here to discuss today, which is the aspects of resolving the conflict. At the end of the Civil War in 2002, of course, I was fortunate afterwards then to obtain a high school scholarship to study in Norway. So I left in 2002 to finish high school in Norway. And at the end of the conflict, the rebels were basically bribed to lay down their guns. So the international community said, if you brought one AK-47, we'll give you $100. Because these kids have been fighting for rebel leaders they never knew. They have been fighting basically a senseless civil war without purpose. They decided $100 wasn't a bad idea. So they participated in the disarmament process. Then there was a peace treaty. It was signed in Lomé, Togo. And that treaty, because the conflict was so brutal, the government of the day decided it did not want to deal with those issues in the future. So the document basically granted amnesty to all warring parties. There was to be no punishment. There was to be no criminal charges. There was only to be peace. But as you remember, the International Criminal Court had come into place in 2002. And the international community was no longer willing to simply settle for grave violations of human rights without doing anything. So after they signed this treaty in Lomé, Kofi Annan at the time said, he reading the treaty, the agreement, decided that this was, senseless. How do you grant complete amnesty to individuals who have maimed, raped, and killed innocent civilians for a decade? While peace was necessary, it was absolutely against international law at the time to grant such amnesty. So the United Nations basically scribbled on the peace agreement that they refuse to accept blanket amnesty for war criminals. So at the end of that agreement, then the government of Sierra Leone, together with the United Nations, came to an agreement to set up the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And the mandate of the Special Court for Sierra Leone was to try only those who bear the greatest responsibility for war crimes in Sierra Leone between 1996 and 2002. Now remember, the war started in 1991, but it would have been too much effort to go prosecuting everyone involved in the Civil War from 1991. So they decided to limit it to 1996 and 2002. So then that court was set up. And then secondly, at the end of the Civil War, the treaty also provided for the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission had already been practiced at the end of apartheid in South Africa. So then, while we needed truth and reconciliation, the international community, through the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone, decided a criminal court was also necessary. Now, many people confound the Special Court for Sierra Leone with the International Criminal Court. They are separate entities. The Special Court for Sierra Leone is a court of its own. It's an international criminal court, but it does not relate to the Rome Statute. It was basically set up through a treaty between the United Nations and Sierra Leone. So then, a few people, like the document says, were then arrested to be tried in the Special Court of Sierra Leone. Rather unfortunately, the main rebel leader, Fode Sanko, died before his trial was completed. And there were a few other people charged, some of whom are now serving their prison terms in Rwanda. The Sierra Leonean prison system is now very good, so those who were found guilty are imprisoned in Rwanda. But one of the most high-profile people indicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone was Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor, as you remember, was head of the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, the main rebel leader in Liberia. He later won an election in 1997 and became president. Through his presidency, he then destabilized the entire West African region, mainly Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. So the first prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone decided to indict him. In fact, he wanted to indict Blaise Compaoré and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. But of course, the United States at the time told him to stay away from those and instead indict only Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor's trial has recently been completed through the appeal system, and he's been sentenced to 50 years of prison, and the United Kingdom decided to take him. So he will be serving his prison terms in the United Kingdom. He has recently cried out that he wanted to be in Rwanda instead, but that's just the nature of Charles Taylor. He likes to raise trouble whenever necessary. He says being in prison in Rwanda will help his family visit, and the UK is an imperialist country, so on and so forth. But I don't think the court is going to condone that. So then the second institution, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also was supposed to bring out what Truth and Reconciliation Commissions mostly do. The truth, the background of the conflict, where we went wrong and how we can fix it. So many people testified, and the court then brought out, the commission then brought out a report with recommendations. One of the recommendations, which is very important, and it is very important to all sorts of truth and reconciliation commissions after violent conflict, is reparation, or sorts of compensation for people who suffered, those who faced the brunt of the civil war. And that's where I think Sierra Leone has failed a little bit. Even though we have very limited resources, I think and believe that it is necessary for the government to put a little bit more effort into providing reparation for those who suffered during the conflict. Because, as you remember, I told you earlier that a lot of people got amputated. Those people are uneducated and can no longer even farm to produce food for themselves. And then they have to live in a very impoverished society. Every time they suffer, they are reminded of that human rights abuse that they faced. And that undermines the whole concept of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is forgiveness. So that's where we have failed. In fact, many of those who were amputated during the conflict are now beggars in the streets of Freetown, which is the capital of Sierra Leone. A few years ago, I visited and found this very appalling. So when I got back to the States, we decided to set up an organization that we now call the Sierra Leone Memory Project. The aim of the Memory Project was to provide a forum so these people can tell their stories, so that the rest of the society can understand their grievances and the suffering that they continue to face in post-conflict Sierra Leone, so that we can establish a dialogue and enable people to understand each other and move forward together. Because the conflict has ended, but without reconciliation, there is not going to be a future. I think that's exactly what Desmond Tutu said after apartheid. Without forgiveness, there's really no future. Because the thing about violent past is somebody always keeps grievance within, and a few years later it comes back to haunt us. And we've seen it in many African conflicts, in Rwanda, for instance. So these are some of the things that we are working on. I will stop there for now, and I think it will be important to give you guys an opportunity through that general spectrum to ask specific questions that you want to know more about. Thank you.